Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, adjunct faculty for Ross University School of Medicine. I'm actually going to be teaching some of the behavioral sciences courses at Ross University, and I'm glad to be talking about epidemiology. And this is labeled Epidemiology 2. We're going to start with 2 and then go back to 1. So let's go ahead and get started. So the learning objectives that you'll be going over by the end of this lecture, you should be able to define and identify incidence and prevalence. And these are some basic concepts that you start with, understanding ratios, etc., etc. And then identify and know when to apply different types of study design. You'll understand the difference between observational and experimental clinical trials, and then compute and interpret several epidemiological measures. So you'll have some practice calculating incidence, prevalence, absolute risk reduction, relative risk, odds ratio, and number needed to treat. And I actually have a video for number needed to treat as something that is an ancillary resource that you can go back and look at the videos. So looking at epidemiology, the study of the distribution and determinants of disease frequency in human populations. So you have distribution, determinants, and frequency. What we're going to be focusing on is determinants. So the incidence, the rate or occurrence or frequency of a disease, concerned with measuring the frequency of new cases, time period is important. I'm going to show you actually a visual that will demonstrate this a lot better, and it's the bathtub example, and it really works to provide a kind of an understanding of all of this. So again, incidence is new cases, the frequency of new cases, and time period, of course you determine that. So number of new cases, number at risk to be a new case, is incidence. So daily trends in number of COVID-19 cases and 7-day moving average of the number of people fully vaccinated in the United States. The orange is going into the 7-day average people fully vaccinated. So the 7-day average of people fully vaccinated actually increased and then dropped down after May of 21 and into September, and then increased. So this is kind of showing the different prevalence rates as it pertains to the moving average. The U.S. COVID cases reported in the CDC in the last 7 days by state and territory. So this is interesting because there is a distribution, and so the higher the distribution, for instance, in Texas, Florida, California, Washington, these all had high distributions of COVID. And then there were other states that had a little less cases. And so as you go around the country, you find cases. So prevalence, the total proportion of individuals in a defined population that has the disease or outcome of interest at a defined instant in time. So it includes both new and old cases. And that's what prevalence is. It's total number of cases, new and old, and total number of people in a population at a point in time. So in this slide, we're looking at the relationship between incidence and prevalence. And again, this is the bathtub scenario where the incident cases are like the water dripping from the faucet. The prevalent cases, so that's the new cases, the water dropping from the faucet. And then the prevalent cases, those are new and old. So that's why it's the existing water plus the new incident cases. And then the deaths, emigrations, and recovery, those just fall out. So let's take a look at an example. So at Ross University, there are 1,200 students enrolled, 500 of whom tested positive for medical student burnout disease. Over the next year, 100 more students tested positive for burnout disease. There are also 300 students who have withdrawn from Ross University. Assuming the number of students enrolled stays constant, what is the incidence of burnout disease at RUSM? So again, incidence is new cases. So when we're looking at new cases, 300 students who have withdrawn, and then over the next year, 100 more students test positive for burnout disease. So looking at an algorithm for classification of types of clinical research. So when you look at did investigator assign exposures, the experimental study was yes, observational study no. And so there's a difference between experimental and observational studies. I was telling you about that before. In an experimental study, you're able to do random allocation between control groups and experimental groups. But when you have a observational study, the comparison group actually becomes the individuals that may not have the disease. And I've done so many of these observational studies and some randomized controlled trials, but not as many. So comparison groups, either analytical study or a descriptive study. And then that analytical study direction, depending on the exposure to outcome, that becomes a cohort study. If in a case control study, you go back to looking for the exposure, and then a cross-sectional study, the exposure and outcome are taking place at the same time. But many people devalue the power of cross-sectional studies, but cross-sectional studies are extremely important observational studies. So observational studies come in many flavors. There's case report, case series, case control, cohort, cross-sectional, and ecological studies. What I'll tell you about this is that ecological studies, the unit of analysis is the population. What that simply means is that in most cases, most instances, for instance, in a case series, you're actually only following one patient over time or one individual over time. Case reports kind of operate in the same way, but case control, cohort, cross-sectional, those are individuals, and then ecological studies are groups. Experimental studies, randomized controlled trials, these are actually, of course, the control groups. And a lot of times there's blinding, double blinding, even triple blinding, where the analysts even don't know, data analysts don't know which group the control group and the experimental group is. Anyway, the blinding will be covered at some other point. But over here, the case reports, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. It's a single case, like I was telling you, exposure included in the history. This is just a run through of what I just told you. Report of a unique clinical presentation, a detailed description of the disease, no comparison to non-disease or unexposed, and statistical test, none. So examples of this is rare genetic disorders, first patients of an I think epidemiologic study. Case series, reports of a group of similar cases, same disease, no disease-free individuals included. Description of cases, exposures are included in the history. One focus is exploring for common exposures. So like case description of anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis in 12 Thai patients. And when you combine the value of multiple patients, then you can provide a good collective sort of case series. Case control study starts with disease in the present and then recruits comparable cases with disease and controls with no disease. So cases and controls are compared on past exposure to a possible risk factor. So retrospective design, good for studying rare diseases. Statistical measure odds ratio and interpretation. Actually, this is a very classic interpretation of shipyard workers. This was actually a study that was done a while back. I believe this was something that was a causality, Bradford Hill causality criteria. One of these was. But shipyard workers, occupational health exposed to asbestos getting lung cancer are 13 times that of a shipyard worker who was not exposed to asbestos. So case control studies can be considered an alternative observational design to identify risk factors for disease outcome. So what you do, the question is that how do diseased cases differ from non-diseased controls with respect to prior exposure history? So what it is compare frequency of exposure. So you go back and you actually compare the frequency of exposure among cases and controls, and then the effect and cause. So you can't calculate disease incidence rates because it does not follow a disease-free population over time. So because you can't tell time, you can't tell which is new cases versus existing cases. So case control, here's the present, and in the present time, you identify a population at risk. And then you split that population at risk to cases and controls. And then cases are split into unexposed and exposed, and controls are split into exposed and unexposed. So going from present and then going back to past and looking for the exposed and unexposed. So you look at the population at risk, split them into cases and controls, and then look at unexposed versus exposed. So cohort studies, all participants are disease-free at the start of the study, compares groups or cohorts of exposed and unexposed individuals. Prospective design, more common, tracks cohorts into the future over time to compare the incidence rates, new cases of the disease between exposed and unexposed. Statistical measure relative risk, aka risk ratio, interpretation. The risk for future lung cancer 7 times greater for those exposed to asbestos compared to those not exposed. So this is where you have prospective and retrospective cohort studies. So in the retrospective design, looks retrospectively at characteristics of a group, disease, and compares risk factors less frequently. often done with rare diseases like pediatric brain tumor. So with the prospective cohort study, the temporal relationship between past, present, and future, the study population is exposed and unexposed. And then in the future, the exposed leads to, so what you know right now is the exposed and unexposed. Then in the future, you look to the outcomes. And so outcome versus no outcome, outcome versus no outcome. But then what's going on in the past is retrospective cohort. And so you actually take it back and then look at the outcomes in the present. Just good to know, because sometimes you have to know the difference between prospective and retrospective cohort studies. Now looking at cross-sectional studies, data collected at one time point surveys, physical measurements. Exposure and outcome determined at the same time, includes exposed and non-exposed, measures prevalence of disease, includes outcomes diseased and non-diseased, measures significant statistical association correlation. Disadvantage cannot examine cause and effect snapshot. Looking at the prevalence, for instance, of breast cancer in a population, finding that a significant number of women from a certain disease. Data collection includes surveys and blood tests. Cross-sectional study, temporal relationship, population, selected sample, risk factor, disease present, risk factor, no disease, no risk factor, disease present, no risk factor, no disease. So I've done a lot of cross-sectional studies. I'm not going to necessarily use this figure to explain this, but what it is that you have a selected sample, and then in that selected sample, you have risk factors with disease present, risk factor with no disease, no risk factor, disease present, and then no risk factor, no disease. Ecological studies uses population level data or group level data used to measure incidence and or prevalence, can be cross-sectional or longitudinal, good for tracking rare diseases. And trust me, ecological studies are capable of a lot more. There's so many ecological studies that are out there. I just got done completing one. And in fact, geospatial studies are mostly ecological studies. And what these are is that you're instead of taking individual, and this will become clear when you do research, but instead of taking the individual measure, you take a group level measure. The randomized clinical controlled trial, gold standard for evaluating treatment effects, trial, experiment test of a treatment, a clinical trial, eligible participants have a diagnosis, compares therapeutic benefits of 2 or more treatments or of treatment compared with placebo. Randomized clinical controlled trial, eligible participants are sorted fairly, equally into the treatment conditions. Double-blind randomized controlled trial, neither the subjects nor the clinicians who evaluate them know their treatment status. So I just again read off this list of definitions, which are wonderful. I think understanding the randomized clinical controlled trial is important, because what it does is that it removes bias by equally providing participants into the treatment conditions. Now, double-blind randomized clinical control trials, neither the subjects nor the clinicians who evaluate them know their treatment status. And there's actually a triple blind, like I was telling you, and the triple blind is that data analysts, the subjects, nor the clinicians know which group is treatment versus placebo. Important notes: experimental study researcher manipulates who is in what group. Study quality improves when the study is randomized, controlled, double-blinded. So clinical trials, these are very important. And what is the purpose of every clinical trial is especially important. So phase 1, you have small number, 50 to 100 samples, 50 to 100 individuals of healthy volunteers. Now, is it safe? That is the question. And it assesses safety and then toxicity, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics. Now, when you're looking at phase 2, moderate number of patients with disease of interest. So does it work? That's the next question in phase 2. Safety is established in phase 1. But when you try to understand, does it work? That's when you have to ask questions about, and this was true about the vaccine and the development of the vaccine for COVID, that assesses treatment efficacy, optimal dosing, and adverse effects. So is it safe and does it work? And then in phase 3, the large number of patients randomly assigned either to the treatment under investigation or to the best available treatment and or placebo. So is it as good or better? Compares the new treatment to the current standard of care, any improvement? Post-marketing surveillance of patients after treatment is approved. That's phase 4. So can it stay? A lot of times there's rare sort of there's sort of side effects that need to be tracked, and this was true about the vaccines that were developed for the vaccines that were developed for COVID. Now, meta-analyses have incredible use and very effective when you have multiple studies and you can combine the different portions and create a meta-analysis. It increases statistical power and allows exploration of subgroups and provides quantitative estimates of effect. So it gives you a take-home message of a number of studies, more than a summary or literature review. So many people think that a meta-analysis is simply a systematic review, and this confusion can be very. It's very simple to get confused with, because a systematic review and meta-analysis are concepts that are talked about in conjunction with each other. So provides quantitative estimates of effect, gives you a take-home message of a number of studies, and then more than a summary or literature review. So here is a diagram which shows all of the present retrospective cohort studies, case control studies, and then what goes into the future. Of course, randomized controlled trials will go into the future. But when you're talking about retrospective cohort studies and case control studies, these are actually going back to the past, starting in the present, going back to the past, looking at exposure. Well, retrospective cohort looks at exposure back here. But the case control study is you select the case and control, and then look back at the risk factors in the past that led to the development of the cases controls. So let's look at what happened in the COVID-19 study. So Ochsner Health population in Louisiana was a retrospective cohort design. 76.9% of COVID-19 hospitalized patients and 70.6% of those who died were Black. So many of the populations that were especially affected were historically minoritized. However, Black patients comprise only 31% of the Ochsner Health population. So even though only 31%, such a higher percentage was COVID-19. Why? Well, let's go into exposure and outcome here. So here you have exposure, yes and no, and then outcome, yes or no. Exposure here would be ethnicity, and then outcome is the hospitalization of COVID-19. So you have total proportions, and we can further develop this